I'm here today to talk to you about lands. Specifically, I want to talk to you about the 640 million acres that we know as public lands. Lands that total the entire states of California, Alaska, Texas, Montana, and Oregon. We share all these lands together, which was why I was deeply upset when Ammon Bundy and a bunch of armed militia took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Harney County, Oregon, one January day of 2016. I was in a weird position. I happened to know why, in part, they were there. I'd visited the Bundy family the year before while researching my dissertation. I was looking at how religion impacted the public land wars. The Bundys are Latter-day Saints. In 1993, Cliven Bundy, Ammon's father, stopped paying federal grazing fees. He had cows in Nevada in the desert, and essentially, he launched a religiously tinged, militia-backed, sagebrush-style insurgency. In 2014, federal agents were sent in to confiscate these illegal cows. This had been over 20 years they'd been illegally grazing, and he'd racked up over $1 million in grazing fees. Ammon, Ryan, and hundreds of armed supporters stood off against federal land officials in what's known as the Battle of Bunkerville. And although armed sharpshooters were positioned throughout that day, the incident ended without bloodshed or violence, but only just barely. I've come to understand in my research that we all carry with us our convictions onto public land, whether they're religious or whether they're not. The first layer is native homeland. These lands are deeply sacred to our country's tribes, but the idea of ownership is a European one. Native people contended that lands were shared, including with future generations. But the idea of shared space and native homeland has not been impressed on the Bundy family. When I went to visit Cliven, I sat in his living room, and he asked me to imagine with him the first Mormon pioneer who made his way out west. He brought with him a team of horses, a wagon, a wife, a family, and maybe a milk cow tied behind. And when they got to a place that looked like it was right for settlement, the first matter of business was for that horse to take a drink. And I'm quoting Cliven now. When that horse took the very first sip of that renewable resource, he created a beneficial use of that resource. Beneficial use. To Cliven, that means a white man's horse taking a drink from a Paiute river. And in his head, this establishes ownership. I'm quoting here again. He said, "This is what the Bundy War, the Range War, is all about right now. It's about protecting three things: my rights, my liberty, and my property." I want to make a point real quick that the Bundys don't represent all Latter-day Saints, but in their case, they really used their beliefs to justify their campaign. Ryan Bundy, who is another son of Cliven Bundy, said, "My Mormonism plays the biggest part of what I do, because the Bundys' war is a religious one." Ammon Bundy posted a YouTube video telling his supporters that God told him to go to Oregon. He said he was there to protect and support a son and father who'd been convicted of arson for setting fire on public lands. They'd been ordered to return to jail to serve out a mandatory sentence. But this was pretext, because Ammon was there to take his own stand. He said he wanted to take the land that had been stolen and give it back to rightful owners, those who have created a beneficial use, the miners, loggers, and ranchers. Never mind that the sawmill had been shuttered for years, that mining had never been an important economic driver in the county, that ranchers were already grazing at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and that Native people had been beneficially using the land for thousands of years before white settlement. So let's look at what Ammon's religion looks like at Malheur. When the Mormon people came to the Great Basin, Brigham Young, their prophet, imagined a Mormon empire. It stretched from Mexico up through Nevada, Utah, and into Oregon. He called this place Deseret. And although this never came to pass, Joseph Smith, the original Mormon prophet, told his people that God had promised them homeland. So they built this homeland next to those chasing manifest destiny who also believed that the land was God-given. So before we even had the idea of public lands, we had a tangle of different interpretations and religiously defined rights. Joseph Smith also told his people, encouraged them, in fact, to have a special relationship with the U.S. Constitution. In fact, the Bundy family wear constitutions just right on the inside of their front pockets. They believe that they understand the Constitution better than constitutional scholars, and they say that the federal government can't own land. Precedent-setting court cases say otherwise, but this has not been impressed on the Bundy family either. Add to this an early church revelation that predicted a day when the Latter-day Saints would protect a constitution as it was hanging by a thread. This is what the Bundys think they're doing in their stands in Oregon and Nevada. They're protecting public land from constitutional mayhem because on public land, they're confronted with different opinions and ideas and notions of proprietorship. The Bundys were inspired to take public lands back from the public, but there are many Americans that have been inspired in very different ways in regards to public land. In 1872, Malheur Lake was part of a nearly 2 million acre northern Paiute reservation. But ranchers from California coveted these grasses and waters and took the land over. When the government failed to honor treaty agreements, the Paiute rebelled, resulting in their forced march onto Yakima lands 350 miles away. Ryan Bundy said, Native people had a right to the land, but they lost that right. It's the current culture that's most important, though we have things to learn from the past. Not only is this ill-informed, it's also self-serving. The Bundys represent themselves as we the people, a catchphrase suggesting that we the people all share their views. We don't. In 1908, Malheur Wildlife Refuge was designated by Teddy Roosevelt, and this was in response, in part, to the feather trade, the plume traders that were decimating wild bird populations for ladies' hats. Malheur was set aside as a safe haven for migratory birds. So what motivated Teddy Roosevelt's actions at Malheur? In part, his own understanding of God. According to historian Mark Stoll, he was raised by parents who were pious Presbyterians, and he came to believe that protecting land was his moral duty. He said, conservation is a great moral issue. But he wasn't as good, actually he was awful about native rights. And he protected lands for people who could afford to visit them as parks and refuges, but not for the people who'd once lived upon those lands. He said, natural resources should be used for the benefit of all, but not for the benefit of a few. But he did not put Native people into that equation. The thing is, Malheur has. Malheur was a good story before it was taken over. It was a place where people with different priorities worked together. Ranchers, conservationists, land managers, and the Burns tribe all worked together. They listened to each other. They built consensus. It's a place where the Burns tribe can go and hunt, fish, and collect reeds for traditional basket making. It's a place where western plovers and trumpeter swans go to breed. And it's also a place where tourists leave behind millions of dollars a year in the local economy. Peter Walker from University of Oregon wrote that the people of Burns had gripes about the government, even some in regards to public land. But they really resented the Bundy's rebellion. The Bundy militia, as some press had come to call them, came into Harney County. They threatened the sheriff's department, they threatened federal officials, and they threatened people who disagreed with them. They kept federal officials from doing their jobs, and they ignored the collaborative history of the place, as well as the many local requests for them to leave. They also rifled through Native artifacts, deeply upsetting the Burns tribe. In Paiute culture, it's a great taboo to touch items that once belonged to the dead, and their rifling was really upsetting for the tribe. They held the refuge hostage for 41 days. And when it was over, some were arrested, the refuge was trashed, taxpayers were left with a bill for millions. The town of Burns was really bitter, and one man was killed. Yet, the layers of cultural conviction at Malheur have not been irreparably cracked by those certain of their own religious authority. I went to California last year to see Ammon Bundy speak at a range rights conference. By then, he'd been in prison for 2 years, and he was later acquitted of both his role in the Malheur takeover as well as the Nevada standoff. He told the audience that he resented those who wanted to protect waters, wildlife, and land. He called them enemies of the people. Seeking some fresh air after the hot tempers of California, I drove north to Oregon to visit the Malheur Refuge. I spent a day among loud and lovely birds who flew across waters that shimmered in a milky sun. I was so grateful that the occupation was over, and on that day, the land was back to the people of Harney County, the birds, the bird watchers, and me. Public land is shared. We all create a beneficial use. Some of us as stewards for wildlife, some of us chasing adrenaline and running rapids and climbing rocks. There are those that make their livelihoods there, running cattle, fixing trail, fighting fires. Some visit ancestors and carry on with traditions that are hundreds of generations in the making, and some even go to find God. The Bundys came onto our lands with a certainty that their convictions trumped all others. They don't. Collaboration can work. It has at Malheur. It took unlikely partners finding common ground. And it so happens we share a lot of common ground. 640 million acres. Lands essential for our wildlife, our watersheds, our spirits, and our future. And it's up to all of us to protect these lands. It's not just from armed bullies. It's intermittent shutdowns, shrinking federal protections, drought, fire, climate change, lack of funds, apathy, and even overuse from visitors. So how do we show up for our public lands? with our voices and our votes, with our presence and our commitment. Visit these lands. In fact, bring people who couldn't be there unless you help them get there. Honor Native rights, foster cultural diversity in these places, write letters, sign petitions, and support active organizations. We share some of the most beautiful mountains, rivers, prairies, beaches, and canyons in the world. This is our privilege, not as individuals, but as American citizens. Thank you.